In 1998, a retired ordnance officer named Belton Y. Cooper published a memoir called Death Traps: The Survival of an American Armored Division in World War II. Presidio Press printed it, Amazon sold it, and within a few years it became one of the best-selling World War II books in the English language. Forums cited it, YouTube channels built episodes around it, documentaries borrowed its framing wholesale. If you've ever heard someone say the Sherman tank was a death trap, a rolling coffin, a Ronson lighter, a machine that sent American boys to die in a war their own generals didn't care about, the odds are overwhelming that the claim traces back, directly or indirectly, to this one book. Nearly everything in it about the Sherman tank was wrong, and the man who wrote it, he never crewed one. That's not an insult, it's his job description. Belton Cooper served in the 3rd Armoured Division, the famous Spearhead Division that fought from the beaches of Normandy to the Elbe River. But he wasn't a tank commander, wasn't a gunner, wasn't a loader, a driver, a bow gunner. Cooper was an ordnance officer assigned to the division's maintenance battalion. His job, day after day, was to receive the Shermans that came back broken, burned out, blown apart. He coordinated recovery and repair, he assessed damage, he catalogued wrecks. Think about what that means. Every single Sherman tank Belton Cooper touched during the war was a casualty. Every one. The tanks that took hits and kept fighting, he never saw those. The crews that survived engagements with their machines intact and drove on to the next objective, they never rolled through his maintenance yard. His entire war was spent surrounded by the wreckage, the worst outcomes, the catastrophic failures, the dead machines with dead men still inside them. His trauma was real. Nobody should question that. But his conclusions were drawn from a sample that was 100% failures, and he didn't seem to realize it. This is a textbook case of what statisticians call selection bias. Cooper saw destroyed Shermans and concluded the Sherman was fatally flawed. A hospital surgeon who only treated gunshot victims might conclude that everyone in a city was getting shot. The logic is identical, and it's identically wrong. But here's the thing. Being wrong in a memoir wouldn't matter much if the memoir hadn't become gospel. Death Traps didn't just sell copies, it colonized popular understanding of the Second World War. For 25 years, from 1998 to the present day, Cooper's version of events has been the default assumption in popular military history. The Sherman was garbage, German tanks were superior, Allied leadership was negligent, American crews were sacrificed. None of this survives contact with the actual evidence. So let's look at the evidence. The Office of the Adjutant General, the U.S. Army's own personnel accounting branch, compiled casualty statistics for the European theatre by arm of service. According to these records, analysed in detail by military historian Stephen Zaloga in his 2008 book Armoured Thunderbolt, the U.S. Army Sherman in World War II, roughly 49,516 Armoured Force personnel deployed to the ETO. Of those, 1,581 were killed in action. The overall casualty rate for armoured forces, including killed, wounded and missing, came to about 13 to 14%. 13 to 14%. Now compare that to the infantry. Frontline rifle companies in the ETO routinely suffered casualty rates exceeding 80% of their authorized strength. Many units were destroyed and rebuilt with replacements multiple times over. In some divisions, the cumulative casualty rate for men serving in line rifle companies approached or blew past 100%. Read those numbers again. Armoured forces, 14%. Infantry rifle companies, north of 80%. If the Sherman was a death trap, it was the safest death trap in the entire US Army. because the men inside it were 6 times less likely to become casualties than the men walking next to it. Cooper never addresses these figures. His book operates entirely on emotional authority, the visceral horror of seeing burned-out hulls. And not once does he grapple with the statistical reality that armoured service was dramatically safer than infantry service by the Army's own records. He couldn't have known the full picture from his maintenance yard. That's precisely the problem. So what about the fire question? Because that's the image that really sticks: Sherman's burning. The so-called Ronson myth, named after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan was supposedly "Lights first time, every time." Shermans were gasoline-powered, and the popular narrative insists that this made them rolling firebombs compared to diesel-engined tanks. Wrong. Wrong on multiple levels. Detailed post-action analysis conducted by both American and British operational research teams during the war itself established that 60 to 80% of Sherman brew-ups were caused not by gasoline fuel fires, but by the cook-off of ammunition propellant. The bagged powder charges for the 75mm and 76mm main gun rounds were stored in bins along the hull sponsons and in the turret basket, right where incoming fire was most likely to strike. A penetrating round hit those bins, the propellant ignited, and the fighting compartment became an inferno before crews could bail out. The gasoline engine was a secondary factor at best. The real killer was where the ammunition sat. And the Ronson nickname itself? Some historians argue it's apocryphal, a post-war invention rather than genuine wartime slang. The evidence for widespread contemporary use is thin. But whether the nickname was real or not, the fire problem was real, and the US Army fixed it during the war. Here's the fix, briefly. Engineers relocated ammunition from the vulnerable sponson bins to new storage positions low in the hull floor, below the turret ring, where incoming rounds were least likely to reach. These redesigned bins were then surrounded by jackets filled with a water-glycerine mixture. If a round breached the bin, liquid flooded the propellant and suppressed ignition. Tanks with this system got a W suffix in their designation: M4A1, 76, W, M4A3, 76, W, and wet stowage became standard on new production Shermans from mid-1944 onward. Now the numbers. Before wet stowage, Shermans caught fire on penetration at rates between 60 and over 80%. After wet stowage, 10 to 15%. According to data compiled by Zaloga from operational research records, wet stowage Shermans were statistically tied with the Panzer IV as among the least fire-prone tanks of the entire war when struck by a penetrating round. Let that sink in. The tank, synonymous with burning, became by late 1944 one of the safest tanks on the battlefield in terms of post-penetration fire risk. The Army identified the problem, engineered a solution, manufactured it, and fielded it to frontline units, all during active combat operations. That's not criminal negligence, that's institutional competence under extraordinary pressure. Cooper's book was published in 1998, 53 years after the war ended. He wrote it from memory, and memory is a treacherous thing even 5 years on, let alone half a century. By contrast, the historians who've dismantled his claims worked from primary documents. Zaloga, author of Armored Thunderbolt and dozens of Osprey military publications, widely regarded as the leading authority on US Second World War armor, built his analysis on unit after-action reports, Army Ground Forces statistical reviews, and operational research studies conducted during the war itself. R.P. Honeycutt, whose 1978 book Sherman, A History of the American Medium Tank, remains the definitive technical reference, documented every engineering decision, every production modification, every variant from primary Army Ordnance records. One man's fading memories versus the entire documentary record of the United States Army and the British Operational Research Establishment. That's the contest. It's not close. Which brings us to the combat exchange rates, the data point that should have killed the myth stone dead. Zaloga's analysis of direct tank versus tank engagements between Shermans and Panthers, drawn from Battle of the Bulge records and other late-war engagements, and published in his 2008 studies Panther versus Sherman, Battle of the Bulge, 1944, and Armored Thunderbolt, found that American forces lost approximately 1.9 Shermans for every 3 Panthers destroyed. Stop and think about the context. In the vast majority of these engagements, the Americans were attacking. They were advancing into prepared German positions. Standard military doctrine holds that an attacking force requires a 3-to-1 numerical advantage to overcome a prepared defense, because the defender gets every advantage that matters: choice of ground, concealment, the ability to fire first. American Sherman crews were attacking into those conditions and achieving exchange rates that would be considered favorable for any attacking force in any era of mechanized warfare. The Panther's superior frontal armor and longer-ranged 75mm KWK-42 gun did not translate in practice into the lopsided dominance the specifications promised. Partly because Panthers broke down constantly. Chronic final drive and transmission failures kept operational readiness below 50% for much of the war. And a Panther waiting for a replacement final drive in a German field workshop killed exactly nothing. And partly because warfare isn't a specifications contest. It's a system, and the Sherman was part of a system that worked. 49,234 Shermans built, against 1,347 Tiger Is across the entire production run, August 1942 to August 1944. You can't win a global war with a boutique weapon. The Tiger consumed fuel at rates that petroleum-starved Germany couldn't sustain, required specialized heavy transport rail cars because its combat width tracks exceeded standard European rail gauge, and demanded depot-level maintenance for routine repairs. Magnificent in a duel, strategically irrelevant. And the Soviets? The T-34, that supposedly superior diesel-powered design. T-34s burned readily and frequently when penetrated, because diesel fuel, when atomized by a high-velocity armor-piercing round inside a confined fighting compartment, ignites just fine. The T-34's ammunition stowage was every bit as vulnerable as the early Shermans. Its two-man turret was notoriously cramped, its hatches limited, its crew escape routes worse. The diesel myth is exactly that, a myth. One more statistic, because it matters. The British Army's No. 2 Operational Research Section, the people who actually studied tank casualties during and after the Normandy campaign, produced data on crew survivability per penetrating hit. This is the measure that cuts closest to the bone, because a penetrating hit is the worst-case scenario. Your armor has failed. The enemy round is inside your tank. What happens to you? In a Sherman, a penetrating hit resulted in approximately 1 crew death on average. For a 5-man crew, that means an individual survival probability of roughly 80%, even when the armor was decisively beaten. The Sherman's comparatively spacious interior allowed crew members to move. Its 5 hatches, one per crew member, more than most contemporary designs, meant escape routes existed even when the tank was burning. When placed alongside equivalent data for German and Soviet tanks, the Sherman compared favourably. The Panther's cramped turret and fewer escape routes didn't consistently outperform it. The T-34 was arguably worse. 80% survival on a penetrating hit. That's not a death trap. That's a machine designed, whether by intention or fortunate circumstance, to keep its crew alive. Now, consider the 3rd Armoured Division, Cooper's own unit. Spearhead landed in Normandy on 23rd to 24th June 1944. As one of only 2 heavy armoured divisions in the entire ETO, the other being the 2nd Armoured, Hell on Wheels, the 3rd maintained a higher authorised tank strength than standard divisions, roughly 232 medium tanks. They were committed to the worst of it, hedgerow fighting in the bocage. The breakthrough of Operation Cobra beginning 25th July 1944. The pursuit across France, the Hurtgen Forest, the Bulge, Cologne, where on the 6th of March 1945, Shermans and newly arrived M26 Pershings fought Panthers in the rubble around the cathedral. An engagement captured on film by a US Army combat cameraman. The division's commander, Major General Maurice Rose, was killed by small arms fire near Paderborn on March 30th, 1945. The highest-ranking American officer killed by direct enemy action in the ETO. The 3rd Armoured took heavy losses. Of course it did. It fought in some of the war's hardest engagements, from June 1944 to May 1945. And Cooper, in his maintenance yard, saw every destroyed tank come through. He saw the charred interiors. He saw the results. What he didn't see, what his role made it impossible for him to see, were the thousands of engagements where Shermans took hits and survived, where crews bailed out, got replacement tanks, and were fighting again by evening, where men like Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole of the 3rd Armoured's 32nd Armoured Regiment commanded a succession of M4A1 Shermans named In the Mood through nearly 2 months of continuous frontline combat, destroying approximately 258 enemy vehicles, until his tank was finally knocked out near Fromental on the 17th of August 1944. Poole lost a leg. He survived. The death trap gave him enough time to get out. Cooper never saw Poole's war. He only saw Poole's wrecked tank. And that asymmetry between what one maintenance officer experienced and what the historical record actually shows is the entire story. Cooper wasn't lying. He was traumatized, and he was sincere, and he was profoundly, consequentially wrong. He published those wrong conclusions 53 years after the events, from memory, without consulting the statistical record, and a publishing industry that preferred dramatic narratives to careful history turned his memoir into the definitive popular account of the Sherman tank. For a quarter century, that account has poisoned the well. It spawned 1,000 forum arguments, 100 YouTube videos, an entire subculture of received wisdom in which the Sherman is a joke, and German engineering is supreme, and Allied leadership was criminally incompetent. Professional historians, Zaloga, Honeycutt, Harry Yeader and others, have been pushing back with primary sources for years. But primary sources don't have the emotional punch of a first-person memoir by a man who says he watched American boys burn alive in defective machines. The myth is stickier than the truth. It always has been. But the truth is still the truth. The M4 Sherman was designed to cross an ocean, drive hundreds of miles under its own power, be repaired by its own crew in the field, and fight a global war at the end of the longest supply chain in military history. It did all of those things. 49,000 of them. It carried its crews through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. Its fire problem was identified and solved during active combat. Its crews survived penetrating hits at rates that matched or exceeded every comparable tank of the war. Its exchange rates against Panthers, while attacking, were favourable by any doctrinal standard. And the book that did the most damage to its reputation was written by the one man in the 3rd Armoured Division who never had to trust his life to one. Cooper saw the dead machines. He never sat inside one when it took a hit and kept fighting. He never bailed out of one that saved his life. He saw only the failures, never the successes. And for 25 years, his failures became the most believed truth in popular Second World War history. The Sherman deserves better. Now you know why. If this changed how you think about the war, subscribe. There's more where this came from.